What a great time I had seeing you tonight, Bryce. I was so happy to be able to give you a hug and a smooch and a butterfly kiss. I have another story for us tonight. It's called Only One Woof. And there it is. Only One Woof. Is this the thing you've been telling me about? I asked. Mr. Wilkin nodded. Aye, that's it. It's always like that. I looked down at the helpless convulsions of the big dog lying at my feet, at the staring eyes, the wildly pedaling limbs. The farmer had told me about the periodic attacks which had begun to affect his sheepdog Jip, but it was coincidence that one should occur when I was on the farm for another reason. And he's all right afterwards, you say? Right as a bobbin. Seems a bit dazed, maybe, for about an hour. Then he's back to normal. The farmer shrugged. I've had lots of dogs through my hands, as you know, and I've seen plenty of dogs with fits. I thought I knew all the causes, worms, wrong feeding, distemper, but this has me beat. I've tried everything. Well, you can stop trying, Mr. Wilkin, I said. You won't be able to do much for Jip. He has epilepsy. Epilepsy? But he's a grand normal dog most of the time. Yes, I know. That's how it goes. There's nothing actually wrong with his brain. It's a mysterious condition. The cause is unknown, but it's almost certainly hereditary. Mr. Wilkin raised his eyebrows. Well, that's a rummin. If it's hereditary, why hasn't it shown up before now? He's nearly 2 years old, and he didn't start this till a few weeks ago. That's typical, I replied. 18 months to 2 years is about the time it usually appears. Jip interrupted us by getting up and staggering toward his master, wagging his tail. He seemed untroubled by his experience. In fact, the whole thing had lasted less than 2 minutes. Mr. Wilkin bent and stroked the rough head briefly. His craggy features were set in a thoughtful cast. He was a big, powerful man in his 40s, and now as the eyes narrowed in that face, which rarely smiled, he looked almost menacing. I had heard more than one man say he wouldn't like to get on the wrong side of Sep Wilkin, and I could see what they meant. But he had always treated me right, and since he farmed nearly 1,000 acres, I saw quite a lot of him. His passion was sheepdogs. A lot of farmers like to run dogs at the trials, but Mr. Wilkin was one of the top men. He bred and trained dogs, which regularly won at the local events and occasionally at the national trials. And what was troubling me was that Jip was his main hope. He had picked out the 2 best pups from a litter, Jip and Sweep, and had trained them with the dedication that he made him a winner. I don't think I've ever seen 2 dogs enjoy each other quite as much. Whenever I was on the farm, I would see them together, sometimes peeping nose by nose over the half door of the loose box where they slept, occasionally slinking devotedly round the feet of their master, but usually just playing together. They must have spent hours rolling about in ecstatic wrestling matches, growling and panting, gnawing gently at each other's limbs. A few months ago, George Crossley, one of Mr. Wilkin's oldest friends and a keen trial man, had lost his best dog with nephritis, and Mr. Wilkin had let him have Sweep. I was surprised at the time because Sweep was shaping up better than Jip in his training and looked like turning out a real champion. But it was Jip who remained. He must have missed his friend, but there were other dogs on the farm, and if they didn't quite make up for Sweep, he was never really lonely. As I watched, I could see the dog recovering rapidly. It was extraordinary how soon normality was restored after that frightening convulsion, and I waited with some apprehension to hear what his master would say. The cold, logical decision for him to make would be to have Jip put down, and looking at the friendly, tail-wagging animal, I didn't like the idea at all. There was something very attractive about him. The big-boned, well-marked body was handsome, but his most distinctive feature was his head, where one ear somehow contrived to stick up while the other lay flat, giving him a lopsided comic appeal. Jip, in fact, looked a bit of a clown, but a clown who radiated goodwill and camaraderie. Mr. Wilkin spoke at last. Will he get any better as he grows older? Almost certainly not, I replied. Then he'll always have these fits? I'm afraid so. You say he has them every 2 or 3 weeks, Well, it'll probably carry on more or less like that with the occasional variations. But he could have one any time? Yes. In the middle of a trial, like? The farmer sunk his head on his chest and his voice rumbled deep. That's it then. In the long silence which followed, the fateful words became more and more inevitable. Sep Wilkin wasn't the man to hesitate in a matter which concerned his ruling passion. Ruthless culling of any animal which didn't come up to standard would be his policy. When he finally cleared his throat, I had a sinking premonition of what he was going to say. But I was wrong. If I kept him, could you do anything for him, he asked. Well, I could give you some pills for him. They might decrease the frequency of his fits. I tried to keep the eagerness out of my voice. Right. I'll come into surgery and get some, he muttered. Fine, but, you won't ever breed him, will you? I said. No, the farmer grunted with a touch of irritability as though he didn't want to pursue the matter farther. And I held my peace because I felt intuitively that he did not want to be detected in a weakness, that he was prepared to keep the dog simply as a pet. It was funny how events began to slot into place and suddenly make sense. This was why he had let Sweet, the superior trial dog, go. He just liked Jip. In fact, Sep Wilkin, hard man though he may be, had succumbed to that offbeat charm. So I shifted to some light chatter about the weather as I walked back to the car, but when I was about to drive off, the farmer returned to the main subject. There's one thing about Jip I never mentioned, he said, bending to the window. I don't know whether it has aught to do with the job or not. He has never barked in his life. I looked at him in surprise. You mean never ever? That's right, not a single bark. To other dogs make a noise when strangers come on the farm, but I've never heard Jip utter a sound since he was born. Well, that's very strange, I said, but I can't see that it's connected with his condition in any way. And as I switched on the engine, I noticed for the first time that while a female dog, and 2 half-grown pups gave tongue to see me on my way, Jip merely regarded me in his camaraderie way, mouth open, tongue lolling, but made no noise, a silent dog. The thing intrigued me, so much so that whenever I was on the farm over the next few months, I made a point of watching the big sheepdog at whatever he was doing. But there was never any change. Between the convulsions, which had settled down to around 3-week intervals, he was a normal, happy, active animal, but soundless. I saw him too in Darrowby when his master came in to market. Jip was often seated comfortably in the back seat of the car. But if I had happened to speak to Mr. Wilkin on these occasions, I kept off the subject because, as I said, I had the feeling that he more than most farmers would hate to be exposed in keeping a dog for other than working purposes. And yet, I have always entertained a suspicion that most farm dogs were more or less pets. The dogs on the sheep farms were, of course, indispensable working animals, and on other establishments they no doubt performed a function in helping to bring in the cows. But watching them on my daily rounds, I often wondered. I saw them rocking along on carts at haytime, chasing rats among the stooks at harvest, pottering around the buildings, or roaming the fields at the side of the farmer, and I wondered, what did they really do? My suspicions were strengthened at other times, as when I was trying to round up some cattle into a corner and the dog tried to get into the act by nipping at a hock or tail. There was invariably a hoarse yell of, "Sit down, dog," or "Get her out, dog." So right up to the present day, I still stick to my theory. Most farm dogs are pets, and they are there mainly because the farmer just likes to have them around. You would have to put a farmer on the rack to get him to admit it, but I think I am right. And in the process, those dogs have a wonderful time. They don't have to beg for walks. They are out all day long and in the company of their masters. If I want to find a man on a farm, I look for his dog, knowing the man won't be far away. I try to give my own dogs a good life, but it cannot compare with the life of the average farm dog. There was a long spell when Sep Wilkin's stock stayed healthy, and I didn't see either him or Jip. And I came across both of them by accident at a sheepdog trial. It was a local event run in conjunction with the Mellerton Agricultural Show, and since I was in the district, I decided to steal an hour off. I took Helen with me, too, because these trials have always fascinated us. The wonderful control of the owners over their animals, the intense involvement of the dogs themselves, the sheer skill of the whole operation always held us spellbound. She put her arm through mine as we went in the entrance gate to where a crescent of cars was drawn up at one end of a long field. The field was on the river's edge, and through a fringe of trees the afternoon sunshine glinted on the tumbling water of the shallows and turned the long beach of bleached stones to a dazzling white. Groups of men, mainly competitors, stood around chatting as they watched. They were quiet, easy, bronzed men, and they seemed to be drawn from all social strata, from prosperous farmers to working men. Their garb was varied: cloth caps, trilbies, deerstalkers, or no hat at all. Tweed jackets, stiff vest suits, open-neck shirts, fancy ties, sometimes neither collar nor tie. Nearly all of them leaned on long crooks with handles fashioned from ram's horns. Snatches of talk reached us as we walked among them. "You got her ere then, Fred. That's a good gather." "Nay, he's missed one. He'll get'n out for that." "Them sheep's a bit flighty." "Aye, they're buggers." And above it all, the whistles of the man running a dog. Every conceivable level and pitch of whistle was now and then a shout. "Sit! Get by!" Every man had his own way with his dog. The dogs, waiting their turn, were tied up to a fence with a hedge growing over it. There were about 70 of them, and it was rather wonderful to see that long row of waving tails and friendly expressions. They were mostly strangers to each other, but there wasn't even the semblance of disagreement, never mind a fight. It seemed that the natural obedience of these little creatures was linked to an amicable disposition. This appeared to be common to their owners, too. There was no animosity, no resentment at defeat, no unseemly display of triumph in victory. If a man overran his time, he ushered his group of sheep quietly in the corner and returned with a philosophical grin to his colleagues. There was a little quiet leg pulling, but that was all. We came across Sepp Wilkin leaning against his car at the best vantage point, about 30 yards away from the final pen. Jip, tied to the bumper, turned and gave me his crooked grin, while Mrs. Wilkin, on a camp stool by his side, rested a hand on his shoulder. Jip, it seemed, had got under her skin, too. Helen went over to speak to her, and I turned to her husband. "Are you running a dog today, Mr. Wilkin?" "No, not this time. Just come to watch. I know a lot of the dogs." I stood near him for a while, watching the competitors in action, breathing in the clean smell of trampled grass and plugged tobacco. In front of us, next to the pen, the judge stood by his post. I had been there for about 10 minutes when Mr. Wilkin lifted a pointing finger. "Look who's there." George Crossley, with Sweep trotting at his heels, was making his way unhurriedly to the post. Jip suddenly stiffened and sat up very straight, his cocked ears accentuating the lopsided look. It was many months since he had seen his brother and companion. It seemed unlikely, I thought, that he would remember him. But his interest was clearly intense, and as the judge waved his white handkerchief and the 3 sheep were released from the far corner, he rose slowly to his feet. A gesture from Mr. Crossley sent Sweep winging around the perimeter of the field in a wide, joyous gallop, and as he neared the sheep, a whistle dropped him on his belly. From then on, it was an object lesson in the cooperation of man and dog. Sepp Wilkin had always said Sweep would be a champion, and he looked the part, darting and falling at his master's commands. Short, piercing whistles, shrill, plaintive whistles. He was in tune with them all. No dog all day had brought his sheep through the 3 lots of gates as effortlessly as Sweep did now, and as he approached the pen near us, it was obvious that he would win the cup unless some disaster struck. But this was the touchy bit. More than once with other dogs, the sheep had broken free and gone bounding away within feet of the wooden rails. George Crossley held the gate wide and extended his crook. You could see now why they all carried these long sticks. His commands to Sweep, huddled flat along the turf, were now almost inaudible, but the quiet words brought the dog inching first one way then the other. The sheep were in the entrance to the pen now, but they still looked around them irresolutely, and the game was not over yet. But as Sweep wriggled towards them, almost imperceptibly they turned and entered, and Mr. Crossley crashed the gate behind them. As he did so, he turned to Sweep with a happy cry of, "Good lad," and the dog responded with a quick jerking wag of his tail. At that, Jip, who had been standing very tall, watching every move with the most intense concentration, raised his head and emitted a single resounding bark. Woof, went Jip, as we all stared at him in astonishment. Did you hear that? Gasped Mrs. Wilkin. Well, by gaw, her husband burst out, looking open-mouthed at his dog. Jip didn't seem to be aware that he had done anything unusual. He was too preoccupied by the reunion with his brother, and within seconds the two dogs were rolling around, chewing playfully at each other as of old. I suppose the Wilkins, as well as myself, had the feeling that this event might start Jip barking like any other dog, but it was not to be. 6 years later, I was on the farm and went to the house to get some hot water. As Mrs. Wilkin handed me the bucket, she looked down at Jip, who was basking in the sunshine outside the kitchen window. There you are, then, funny fellow, she said to the dog. I laughed. Has he ever barked since that day? Mrs. Wilkin shook her head. No, he hasn't. Not a sound. I waited a long time, but I know he's not going to do it now. Ah, well, it's not important, but still, I'll never forget that afternoon at the trial, I said. Nor will I. She looked at Jip again, and her eyes softened in reminiscence. Poor old lad, 8 years old and only one woof. One of those quirks of animal behavior which are delightful but inexplicable. I will never know how it happened, and if I had not witnessed the whole thing, I would have found it difficult to believe. Many children write to me about my books, and this story is one which particularly seemed to capture their imagination. As a result, it has been specially adapted for my young readers and illustrated by Peter Barrett. The story of a dog who gave only one single bark throughout his long life just had to be called Only One Woof. It was published last September. And that's the end of that. You will remember this is the story in the first book that we read of Jim Harriet's, and it is abridged, so that just means it was shorter than this one. Interesting. Anyway, Bryce, I hope you enjoy the story. I hope it's not too much trouble to listen to it how I sent it today, and if it is, let me know and we'll find out another way to send it. All right, sweetie, I love you. Have a good night. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.